The forgotten forest, the inescapable truth. Amelia froze at the sight of her brother. His body was twisted and unnatural, a sickening mockery of the man she once knew. His skin was pale, stretched taut over his bones, and his eyes, those hollow, empty pits, seemed to see right through her. But it was his voice that terrified her the most. That soft, familiar whisper, pleading, calling her name as if nothing had changed. "Amelia, don't leave me." Her mind raced, torn between the desperate need to flee and the gnawing guilt that rooted her to the spot. She had come this far to save him, but looking at him now, she wondered if there was anything left to save. Was this creature still her brother? Or was it just a shell, twisted and hollowed out by the curse? "Thomas?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "Is it really you?" He stepped closer, his movements jerky, as though he had forgotten how to walk. His hand stretched out toward her, skeletal and cold. "Amelia, you can't leave. The forest, it won't let you. It's part of us now. You're part of it." Her breath hitched. She took a step back, clutching the pouch of herbs and the parchment tighter. The curse was supposed to be broken. She had performed the ritual, recited the ancient words. But the forest was still alive, and so was its hold on Thomas. "Please," she begged, her voice cracking. "I came to save you. I did everything I could. We can leave together." His twisted smile deepened. "No one leaves, Amelia. Not really." She could feel the weight of the forest pressing in around her again, the same suffocating darkness she had felt before. The trees loomed taller, their branches creaking as if they were reaching for her. The ground beneath her feet seemed to pulse with the same eerie rhythm she had heard when she first entered the forest. The forest wasn't done with her yet. It was waiting. Amelia's heart pounded in her chest, her pulse racing in her ears. She had to move. She had to get out before the forest consumed her like it had consumed Thomas. But as she turned to flee, she heard the whispers again. They were everywhere, in every shadow, in every rustling leaf. "Stay. Stay with us." Her legs trembled as she forced herself to run, the whispers growing louder, more insistent. Thomas's voice joined them, pleading with her, calling her back. "Don't leave me, Amelia. You can't leave me." But she couldn't turn back now. She tore through the underbrush, branches slashing at her arms and legs, the forest seeming to twist and shift around her, trying to keep her trapped. No matter how fast she ran, the path in front of her seemed endless, looping back in on itself. She was running in circles, and the whispers were closing in. Suddenly, she stumbled into the clearing where the massive blackened tree had once stood. The tree was gone, its twisted roots now lying lifeless on the ground, but the air was still thick with the forest's presence. Amelia fell to her knees, gasping for breath, her entire body shaking with exhaustion and fear. She felt it then, the cold touch of a hand on her shoulder. She didn't need to look to know who it was. "Amelia?" Thomas's voice was soft, but it was no longer pleading. Now it was filled with something darker, something insidious. "You're one of us now. You can't escape." She squeezed her eyes shut, tears streaming down her face. This wasn't how it was supposed to end. She had come to break the curse, to save her brother, but now she was trapped. The forest had her, just as it had him. But then, in the depths of her despair, she remembered something Mari had said. The forest changes those it claims, but there's always a choice. You have to fight it, or it will consume you. A spark of defiance ignited within her. She wasn't going to let the forest take her, not without a fight. Amelia reached into the pouch Mari had given her and pulled out the herbs. With trembling hands, she scattered them around her in a circle, muttering the words of protection Mari had taught her. The air around her seemed to vibrate, the forest recoiling as the herbs burned and smoked. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, as if they could feel her slipping away from their grasp. Thomas's voice became a low, guttural growl, and the cold hand on her shoulder tightened painfully. "You can't leave us, Amelia. You belong to the forest now." She gritted her teeth and stood, clutching the parchment tightly in her hands. "I don't belong to you. I'm not part of this curse. I'm not like you." The ground beneath her feet began to tremble, the trees groaning as the forest itself seemed to rage against her defiance. But she didn't stop. She recited the incantation again, louder this time, her voice rising above the chaos. "I break the bond. I renounce the curse." The darkness around her writhed, the shadows twisting and contorting as the forest fought to maintain its hold. Thomas's face flickered in front of her, his expression one of pain and rage. "You can't leave." But Amelia's voice didn't falter. "I break the bond. I renounce the curse." With a final earth-shaking tremor, the forest let out a deafening roar. The shadows around her dissolved, and the cold grip on her shoulder vanished. The air cleared, and for the first time, the oppressive weight of the forest lifted. Amelia collapsed to the ground, gasping for breath. The silence that followed was overwhelming, almost surreal. The whispers were gone. The forest was still, but Thomas was gone too. Amelia lay there for what felt like hours, staring up at the sky as the first rays of dawn broke through the trees. She had escaped. She had broken the curse. But the cost was higher than she had ever imagined. When she finally found the strength to stand, she looked around at the forest that had once been her enemy. The trees were no longer twisted and blackened, but there was an emptiness in the air, a void where the forest's dark presence had once been. She walked slowly out of the forest, her body aching, her mind numb. She had done what she had set out to do, but the victory felt hollow. She had lost her brother to the curse, and even though she had broken it, she knew that a part of him would always be tied to this place. As she reached the edge of the village, she looked back one last time at the forest. The shadows no longer seemed to move, and the air was still. But in the distance, just beyond the tree line, she thought she saw a figure standing there, watching her. Thomas. He was gone, but the forest would never let her forget. Amelia returned to the village in silence, the weight of what had happened pressing down on her like a leaden fog. Her steps were heavy, and her limbs ached with exhaustion, but it wasn't just her body that felt broken. It was her spirit. She had broken the curse, but Thomas was gone, and she couldn't shake the feeling that she hadn't truly escaped the forest. The memories clung to her, more vivid and haunting with each passing second. The villagers greeted her with wary eyes. They knew something had happened, could feel the shift in the air, but no one asked questions. They just stared, murmuring among themselves as Amelia walked past, her clothes torn and her face hollow. She made her way back to the small house she had shared with Eli and Thomas, now feeling empty and cold, like a tomb. Inside, she collapsed onto the bed, her body trembling. Sleep came, but it was no refuge. The dreams were worse than she could have imagined. In her dreams, she was back in the forest. The trees whispered her name, their branches reaching for her like grasping fingers. And always, always, Thomas was there, watching from the shadows, his hollow eyes filled with sorrow and anger. "You can't leave, Amelia. You're still part of this." She would wake, drenched in sweat, gasping for breath, only to fall back into the same nightmare the moment her eyes closed. The whispers followed her everywhere, into her dreams, into the waking world. No matter how hard she tried to convince herself that it was over, that the curse had been broken, she couldn't escape the feeling that something was still lurking, waiting for the right moment to strike. The lingering presence days turned into weeks, but Amelia couldn't shake the unease that clung to her like a second skin. The villagers kept their distance, their whispers growing louder, more fearful. Some even started avoiding her altogether, crossing to the other side of the road when they saw her coming, muttering about the curse that had taken root in the forest and how it had followed her back to the village. She could see it in their eyes, the doubt, the suspicion. They didn't believe the curse was truly gone, and deep down, neither did she. Strange things began to happen around the village. Small, inexplicable occurrences at first. Windows left open despite being closed the night before. Strange noises in the woods at night. Whispers carried on the wind that made the villagers huddle together in fear. And always, Amelia felt that creeping sensation of being watched, as if the forest itself had followed her home. The worst came at night. She would wake in the middle of the night to the sound of footsteps outside her window, slow, deliberate, as if someone or something was pacing just beyond the house, watching her, waiting for her to notice. She would sit up, her heart pounding, but every time she looked, there was nothing there, nothing but the thick, oppressive darkness of the night. And yet the feeling of being watched never left her. One night, she heard it more clearly than ever, the unmistakable sound of someone calling her name. "Amelia!" Her blood turned to ice. It was his voice. Thomas. She bolted upright, her heart racing. The voice was coming from outside, drifting through the open window. Slowly, against every instinct that told her to stay inside, she got up and moved to the window, her breath shallow. Outside, the night was still and quiet, but the shadows seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy, and there, standing just at the edge of the trees, was a figure. It was Thomas, or what used to be him. His hollow eyes stared at her from the darkness, his body a twisted silhouette against the night. He stood there, unmoving, watching her with that same sorrowful, accusing look. "Amelia," he whispered again, "you can't leave." She stumbled back from the window, her heart hammering in her chest. This couldn't be real. It wasn't possible. She had broken the curse. Thomas was gone. The forest's grip had been severed, but the voice was so real. His face, his eyes, they were burned into her memory. And now he was here, standing just beyond the house, calling to her. She sank to the floor, her back against the wall, trembling. The whispers from the forest had followed her home. The curse was still alive. The return to the forest. Amelia knew deep down that there was only one way to end this. Truly end it. The forest still had a hold on her, on Thomas, and if she didn't face it, it would never let her go. The next day, she made her decision. She would return to the forest one last time to find the source of the whispers, the thing that had claimed Thomas and now reached out for her. This time, she wouldn't try to break the curse or perform any rituals. She would face whatever was left of the forest's darkness head on. As she packed her bag, her hands shaking, she felt a strange sense of finality settle over her. She didn't expect to return this time, not after what she had seen, not after what the forest had shown her, but she had to try. She had to put an end to it, or it would haunt her for the rest of her life. With one last glance at the village, at the place that had been her home, she turned and made her way back to the edge of the forest. The trees loomed before her, their branches twisted and gnarled, but this time they didn't feel like strangers. They felt like old enemies, waiting for her to return. As she stepped into the shadows of the trees, the whispers began again, faint but unmistakable. They called her name, beckoning her deeper into the woods. Amelia, come home. She walked deeper into the forest, her heart pounding, her senses on high alert. The air was thick with the same heavy presence she had felt before, and every step seemed to draw her closer to something she couldn't see, but could feel. The darkness around her pulsed, alive with the memory of what the forest had once been, and then, just ahead, she saw it, a figure standing in the clearing, waiting for her. It was Thomas. He looked the same as he had the night she saw him at her window, his body twisted, his eyes hollow, but there was something different about him now. He wasn't just standing there, he was waiting. Amelia. His voice was soft, filled with longing. You came back. She stepped closer, her heart heavy with grief and fear. I had to. I couldn't leave you like this. Thomas smiled, but it was a twisted, unnatural thing. The forest isn't done with us. It's never done, but now you're part of it, too. Amelia felt the cold, creeping tendrils of the forest wrapping around her, pulling her closer to him, to the heart of the darkness. She could feel it now, the truth she had been avoiding all this time. She hadn't broken the curse. She had become part of it, and now there was no escape. Amelia stood frozen in the clearing, her heart pounding in her chest. The air was thick with the palpable weight of the forest, and her brother, Thomas, or what remained of him, was a shadow of the person he once was, consumed by the curse that had long ago twisted his soul. His hollow eyes bore into hers as he spoke again, his voice a low murmur that seemed to echo through the trees. You can't run from it, Amelia. You're one of us now. The forest won't let you leave. She shook her head, stepping backward, her pulse racing as if trying to break free from her own skin. She wanted to scream, to deny it, but deep down, she knew there was a part of her that believed him. The forest had marked her, drawn her in, and now it wouldn't let her go. What is this? She asked, her voice shaking. Why? Why can't I leave? Thomas tilted his head, a crooked smile forming on his lips. The forest feeds on us. It always has. Once it takes you, you're never truly free. It took me, and now it's taken you. Amelia felt the weight of those words like a punch to the chest. The forest had been hungry, and now it had them both. But there had to be a way out. There had to be something she could do to escape the forest's clutches, something to sever the ties that bound her to this cursed place. I won't let it take me, she whispered, more to herself than to Thomas. I won't let it. But the forest didn't care what she wanted. It was a force older than her, older than anything she could comprehend. It was alive, and it had chosen her. As she stood there, paralyzed by the horror of her situation, the ground beneath her feet began to tremble. The trees around her seemed to groan and shift, their branches reaching down like skeletal hands, casting shadows that danced in the faint light. The whispers returned, louder now, more insistent. Amelia, stay with us. The words echoed in her mind, wrapping around her like a vice. But she forced herself to move, to run. She couldn't let herself be consumed by the forest, not like Thomas. She had come this far, and there had to be a way out. Without another word, she turned and sprinted deeper into the forest, the twisted roots and jagged branches tearing at her clothes and skin. The whispers grew louder with every step, and she could hear Thomas's voice mingling with them, calling her name. But she didn't stop. She couldn't. The deeper Amelia went into the forest, the more disoriented she became. The trees seemed to move around her, closing in like a living maze, and the path ahead was constantly shifting, twisting in impossible ways. She had lost all sense of direction, all sense of time. Daylight had long since disappeared, replaced by an eternal twilight that cast the world in eerie shadows. Her breath came in ragged gasps, and her legs burned with the effort of running. She didn't know where she was going, only that she had to keep moving. If she stopped, if she let the whispers catch up to her, it would be over. The forest's presence was suffocating now, pressing in from all sides. It was no longer just a place. It was a living, breathing thing. Every tree, every rock, every blade of grass seemed to pulse with the same dark energy. And it wanted her. As she ran, she began to hear things, voices, familiar voices from her past. Her mother calling her home for supper, Eli laughing as they played in the fields. She could even hear Thomas's voice, not twisted and hollow like it was now, but warm and comforting, like it used to be before the curse. "Amelia, don't leave me." The voices tugged at her, pulling her in different directions, and she began to question what was real and what wasn't. Was the forest playing tricks on her mind? Or was she losing herself to the same darkness that had taken Thomas? Her vision blurred, and she stumbled, falling to the ground. The impact knocked the wind out of her, and for a moment, she lay there, staring up at the dark canopy above her. The trees swayed unnaturally, their branches whispering her name, their shapes twisting and morphing into grotesque figures. She squeezed her eyes shut, trying to block it all out, but the whispers were inside her now, clawing at the edges of her sanity. "You're part of the forest now, Amelia," the voices said, overlapping and blending together. "You belong to us." She clamped her hands over her ears, screaming into the darkness, but it made no difference. The forest was in her mind, in her blood, and there was no escaping it. "I won't let you take me," she shouted, her voice raw with fear and desperation. "I won't become like him." But even as she said the words, she could feel the forest's grip tightening around her. Her limbs felt heavy, as though the earth itself was pulling her down, and the shadows seemed to stretch toward her, ready to swallow her whole. The heart of the forest. When Amelia opened her eyes again, she was no longer in the dense undergrowth. She was standing in a wide, open space, a clearing surrounded by towering trees that seemed to form a circle around her. At the center of the clearing stood an ancient tree, far larger and darker than the others, its bark gnarled and blackened, as if it had been scorched by fire. This was it, the heart of the forest. The whispers were deafening here, the air so thick with them that it felt like Amelia could hardly breathe. The ground beneath her feet trembled, and the trees groaned, their branches swaying in an unnatural wind. And then she saw him, Thomas. He stood in front of the ancient tree, his form flickering in and out of the shadows, as though he was part of the forest itself. His hollow eyes locked onto hers, and a twisted smile crept across his face. "You've come home, Amelia." She took a step back, her heart racing. "No, but this isn't my home. I'm not like you." Thomas's smile widened. "You've always been like me. The forest has been waiting for you. It knew you would come." The tree behind him seemed to pulse with life, its roots digging deep into the earth, as if it was drawing power from the very ground beneath it. Amelia could feel the darkness emanating from it, seeping into her skin, into her soul. "I won't let it take me," she said, her voice trembling. "I won't let it win." Thomas stepped closer, his twisted form flickering in the dim light. "It's already taken you, Amelia. You're part of it now. You can't escape." Amelia's mind raced. She couldn't let this be the end. There had to be a way to fight back, to sever the forest's hold on her once and for all. She reached into the pouch at her side, pulling out the last of the herbs Mari had given her. They had worked before, if only for a moment. She scattered the herbs around her, muttering the words of protection under her breath. The air around her seemed to shift, and for a brief moment, the whispers faltered. But then the ground shook violently, and the ancient tree's roots burst from the earth, snaking toward her. Thomas's voice was louder now, more insistent. "You can't fight it, Amelia. The forest is stronger than you." The roots wrapped around her ankles, pulling her toward the tree, but she didn't stop. She kept reciting the incantation, louder and louder, until her voice drowned out the whispers. "I break the bond. I renounce the curse." The forest roared in fury, the shadows writhing and twisting. But Amelia didn't stop. She screamed the words into the darkness, her voice hoarse, her body shaking. "I break the bond. I renounce the curse." And then, with one final, earth-shattering tremor, the ancient tree let out a deafening crack. The roots recoiled, the shadows flickered, and the whispers went silent. The forest was still. Amelia collapsed to the ground, gasping for breath. The clearing around her was empty. Thomas was gone, and the ancient tree lay in ruins, its blackened bark shattered and lifeless. It was over. She had broken the curse. But as she lay there, staring up at the dark sky, she couldn't shake the feeling that something still lingered. The forest was quiet now, but it had left its mark on her, deep, unseen, and permanent. And she knew in her heart that she would never truly be free.